these items under our layouts folder here. So this is our design view. We drag buttons onto the screen this way. We drag text fields, that sort of thing. And up until this point, we've just been adding buttons this way. I can add it here and that sort of thing. What I have set up already, what I should actually switch over to is make sure I'm in the content view of this. Yep, okay, let me switch over here, just clean these up a little bit. Okay, that's what I want to see. All right, so what I actually have set up is I've nested all of these buttons and widgets in a linear layout. And so if I click on this one, you can see that it takes up the entire screen. You probably can't see it on the overhead, the projector, but there's a blue outline to denote that this linear layout is taking up the entirety of my activities screen. And then nested within that is my text edit field and my button. And because it's a linear layout, you can see that it's linear vertically. I don't know if you can see that in the top right hand corner, but it says linear layout vertically. And that just means that when I add a new button, it's going to lay it out vertically in the order that it appears in this hierarchy. So for the top one, we have our text edit, and then we have our save button. In this hierarchy, if I drag the button from the bottom to the top and put it in between there, so I'm dragging it and letting it go right above my text field, you can see that my UI changes. And that's kind of interesting. You say, well, why in the hierarchy is it changing my actual display? And this is because how the linear layout works. If you do that in a relative layout, then well, other things happen. It might not be what you expect, but usually nothing really happens depending upon how you set it up. But you can swap those back and forth in a relative layout and nothing really happens. And so this is one way to affect your layout, but if I okay, so that's how linear layouts work vertically. If I wanted to switch that to a horizontal layout, I would change the orientation of that layout, and that doesn't have anything to do with rotating the device. So that's not the orientation of the device, it's the orientation of my linear layout. So right now it's vertically. If I want to set it to horizontally, then you can see that now my save button's disappeared, and if I drag my save button above my text field, you see that that's my button is on the left, my text field's on the right. And the reason is because my text field actually has the width set out to match parent. And because my button has its width set to wrap content, it's going to take up as little space as it needs to, and then what my text field is going to do is it's going to take up the remaining space. And if I switch that, my text field is set to match the parent, so it's going to take up as much space as it can based on the parent, and then whatever room is left over for my save button, it's going to leave it. And you can see my save button is now switched to nothing, and so you don't see the save button. One way to fix that is I can set these both to, instead of match parent, to wrap content, but because there's no content in that text field, it's going to basically become 10 pixels, let's say. And then my save button is going to wrap its content and take up as much room as it needs. And so this is kind of awkward for a layout. And so if you wanted something that would have, let's say, right about 0.8, and you can see this overlay that comes up with my weight. And what this is saying is, it's kind of like percentages. That text field is going to take up 80% of the width, and then whatever remaining objects, they can have the remaining 20%. Well, I don't need 20% of that space for my button because the button is set to wrap content, so it's going to wrap whatever it is, and the content is the save field here. So if I want to change that, I can say save location, and you can see the button got bigger. The button got bigger because its content inside of it got bigger, and because it's wrap to content and the content got bigger, the wrap became bigger as well. So that's how we kind of lay out things. But now you've noticed that, well, okay, my button's kind of, skewed a little bit toward the left here, and maybe I want to align it to the right, but I can't do that because when it's set to linear layout, or linear layout, but in the horizontal, it's going to shift everything to the left. I can change that. I can have everything shift to the right, but what I really want to do is either one, well, there's a couple things you can do, and this is kind of where it becomes complicated, is I can either increase this weight. Let's get a good weight here. Okay, so this weight was actually way more than 100%. And you can see it's starting to chop the button off. And what we can do is we can switch this over to right now it's on a Nexus 4, so it's about a 4-inch screen, or 4.7-inch screen. I should read these a little bit better. You have a Nexus 7, which is 7 inches. We have a Nexus 5, which is 5 inches. Nexus 9, Galaxy Nexus, and so we can see if we want a tablet, what this looks like on a tablet. So we'll switch over to our Nexus 9. So we drop that down, give it a second. So you can see in landscape view what this will look like. And this looks actually even more terrible. If I zoom in on this, let me clean this up a little bit. Okay, you can see that really hid my buttons. So that's a terrible layout. Let me see what it looks like on the Nexus 10. Okay, my button disappears altogether. Let's see what happens if I change the orientation. Okay, my button kind of comes back a little bit. So let me affect this. Let me make the weight a little bit less so that my save button comes in, but I still want that to be right aligned. I'm not going to play too much with this, but let's say right there is good. Okay, now the user is going to rotate the device back to landscape. And okay, that's starting to look pretty good. Now there's a little bit too much extra room, so that not ideal, but that would work. Now let me switch back to my Nexus 4. And okay, that looks pretty good. But as you see, the margin on the right's kind of, iffy. Let me make it a little bit more obvious. What we can do is we can go back over here and change the layout gravity and switch this. Oops, actually. Switch the gravity of, so the gravity is going to essentially kind of push and pull, or actually just push, or I don't know what gravity does, I guess it pulls, to a direction that you set. So if I want it on the right hand side, you can see everything shifted over to the right. I can also center that horizontally. I got to turn off the right gravity as well. You could also do fill and probably turn off center gravity there. And you can play around with these to see what would best lay out your fields here. So that's the end, so everything goes to the end of that one.
What does fill do?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Well, it sounds like what you would want it to do would have both of them fill it together, but
no, yeah. So this is just on the linear layout. So it's telling it how it's going to fill out the layout here. It's not. Yeah, it's not what you think it is. That part I know. And so what we want to do here is there's a couple things that we could do. So selecting that one, we can actually change the left margin, which margin is somewhere down here, or padding, excuse me. The margin is, if the equivalent to a margin is the layout width. So instead of, I'm jumping ahead of myself, sorry. Let me go down to padding, and I'll show you what padding is. Padding is going to be the surrounding padding of the button, and so I can change that, just show you what that looks like. I want to change the left padding, so left is up here, and you can do this little dot thingy to get a constant. And so constants, you can set these constants based on if it's a tablet view. We don't have any set, but that would actually be in your values field. I'm just going to set, let's say, 50. Oops. Yeah. Yep. DPI. No. Well, let's start with pixels. You can do this by pixels, but what we want to use is actually dips.
You're hitting enter, it's adding.
Thank you. I was like, what? Okay, thank you. What was it complaining about? That's what. Okay, so you can see how the padding is affecting the button. So the padding on the left and on the top I've set to fix 50 dips, which are density independent pixels, and that will. So this will scale based on whether it's a tablet or on a phone like this Nexus 4 is. So that's why we use dips instead of pixels. You can set them to pixels if you want, but it's going to look different on different devices. And so that's what padding does. Now if I wanted to change the margin to 50 dips, now you can see that changed the outside of this blue box. And so anytime you see layout here, it's going to affect everything outside of that blue box. And when you go down into the options here, it's going to affect everything within that blue box. And so with the gravity, you can see that this save location is, well, it's probably a bad example, but if I wanted to center that, it's actually, yeah, that's not going to affect it because it's already pretty much centered. Anyway, this gravity is going to affect your text. Let's see if I can do center, vertical, and then change the, where am I? Padding for the bottom. And I guess I also have to affect the height, like that. Anyway, you can see that that's centered vertically, and then if we change, let's see, to top, that the text is on the top of the button. So this is actually very consistent across all of our UI elements. If I want to put that on the bottom for some reason, top and bottom centers it, but if I turn off the top, you can see it's at the bottom. The bottom actually goes below the bar here, but if I resize that, that's how it goes. So you can play around with those to affect how your widgets look like. But again, all the attributes that start with layout, so layout colon, that's going to affect everything outside of the blue box, and then everything else pretty much affects everything inside of that blue box. So let me turn off some of these attributes. Actually, I'm going to go into the code by selecting the tab at the bottom and just turning off some of these attributes. Here, center. So if you're ever having trouble with your design view, you can always go into code and just edit it. The labels here, the attributes are pretty self-explanatory. So doing that pretty much helps me with that. So I'm going to make this look a little bit better. I'm going to go in my layout. Let's see, I want to add my layout margin on the left here, and instead of making this weight, 50%, whatever I did, let's change that weight to 1, and that should be okay. And so that's a linear horizontal. Now if I switch that up again and change that back to vertical, it messes it all up because yeah, I don't even know what element this is. That's my name field, that sort of thing. So yeah, just be careful when you're going through this, changing the orientation, how that works. I'm just going to switch that back to horizontal. And again, if I mess that up, I can go back and delete those attributes or reset these. Okay, let's see. So let's affect my, let's say for my linear layout I wanted to change the background color. So find the attribute that says background, and it's just asking for a text field. So you're like, what do I type in there? You can get some hints by typing or clicking on this little button here, and you can set the color manually. So if I move this over to the side, you can see that it has an RGB value. If I set this to red and hit enter, you can see I changed that color. But it also has, it's not only an RGB value, but it's an ARGB value. And the A stands for alpha, so transparency. And then RGB obviously is red, green, and blue. If I want to change the transparency, I can drag this little guy over to the left and say, from a value of 255, or 254, or 5, yeah, it's 255. There's 256 colors or values starting at 0, so the max value is 255. Let's say I want to set that to 50% opacity. That would be 256 divided by 2, which is 128, if you guys know your base 2s. And by clicking on that, what it's going to do is show whatever's in the background, which in this case is white, in the background of our activity, I should say, and show through that red. So this is kind of a pinkish, maybe salmon color. And so you can make these different colors. You can also add images as well. If I scroll down in our project, I don't think we have, let's see what we got here. These are all, let's see what this will actually do. So I mean, I just picked out a random image, but you can set a random image to that. Yes?
Is there a way to change the line on your input text field from black to something else?
That's a good question. So, there's all sorts of like tinting you can do. I don't know off the top of my head.
And the other question I had was, you messed with gravity.
Yeah.
Is it better to use that or DP, since are they basically using the same percentages kind of? What's the best practice?
For what do you want to set exactly?
The width of something? Should you set it to the percent of the parent or do a...
Okay, so gravity is not going to affect the width. It's going to, if you took it and kind of shifted it, whether that would fall to the left, fall to the right, that sort of thing. The DPs?
Expanded the width of it. Was it gravity?
Oh, the weight.
The weight, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a preference to use weight or a set width in DP?
Yeah, it depends on what you're trying to go for. So if you always want, let's say you have two elements and you always want them to be 50-50, you want them to be equal on both sides, then you'd probably set the weight for each one of those to be 50-50. And that way, no matter what the width is for your device, those always take up the same percentage of space. So weight is really great for percentages with things like this, where I essentially want the text field to take up as much space as possible, and then I want the button to take up on the left hand or on the right hand side as much room as it needs, and then push that text field as small as it can. Or in other words, make the text field fill up the remaining space that the button doesn't fill up. Then the linear layouts with the wrap content set on the button, and this one would probably be, let's see, so the proper way to do that would be to actually make this, let's see, so I was thinking you could wrap, I mean, there's a million different ways you could do this. You can wrap these in other layouts. So for example, let me actually add another layout because I want to actually get to that before. I'm going to put a layout inside my relative layout. Yeah, and you can't actually change this. So let me go ahead and change this to vertical. Change these attributes. I'm going to do this really quickly. Okay, so I'm just deleting everything that's custom there so we get our UI element back. Now everything's laid out in a vertical layout. What I want to do is actually lay out the these guys inside of my horizontal layout. So just drag these below it, okay, in the hierarchy. And so you can see now my linear layout horizontal is within my vertical layout. So if I add another button, let's add it somewhere. Actually, I'm going to add it here. Oop, can't do that. Here. But see, it automatically goes in my horizontal layout. Let's see if I can drag this out to be... Now, based on the hierarchy, it is below my horizontal layout, but inside of my vertical layout. So it's actually stacked. My horizontal layout's stacked on top of the button. The button's at the very bottom because this got squished because its match parent is height. I want it to match or wrap the content. And see, now you can see it only wraps the content. Here it looks like I have an extra button in there. Okay, so it wraps the content height-wise, and now I have my button vertically here. And so what you're asking is, let's take this one, expand it 100%. Let's see, width. You got to play around with this. Sometimes it doesn't work the way you think it does. So like that pushed it all the way out to the outside. Let's do wrap content. Usually I don't stick buttons next to text fields like that, but if you wanted to do it that way, yeah, I'm gonna just go back to the weight attribute here. And then probably what I would do is also set the weight to this guy. To that was 0.9, 0.10, and probably 10% is a little high, so let me set that to 0.7, so 7%. And then for this guy, instead of 9, I'd do 9.3, something like that. So that's probably the best way, and then you could always test that by going into a Nexus 10 landscape and saying that, yeah, that looks pretty good. There's probably a little bit, there's a lot of margin left on the right hand side, but it's equal to that on the left hand side. So that's probably the way I do it, but you should probably just have your buttons below it. Which brings me to relative layout. So I'm going to add a relative layout here. Put that button inside of this relative layout. Okay, now what relative layout gives me a little bit more freedom. It's relative to other objects in that layout. So I have other buttons or the layout itself. So I want to drag this. You can see that these arrows that, I don't know if, yeah, you can see that, top and to the left, it's relative to the top of the screen and to the left of the screen. And actually, it's relative to the layout, not the screen itself, so it's whatever wrapped is in there. And if I go to the text, you can see that, again, anything that begins with layout is for the outside. So it's going to say align parent top, yes. Align parent left, yes. Align parent start, true. And then it tells it how many density independent pixels that it needs to do from the left, from the start, which is the same thing as the left in this case, and then the top. So it's 295 density independent pixels from the left and 120 pixels from the top. And so that's how you get relative layout. You can also, do, if I added another button here, I can set this button relative to that first button. So if you saw those little lines pop up, if I go to that second button's value, I can see that the layout to the right of button 2, which is this guy here, that's just called button 2 because it's the second button that I added, to the end of button 2. And so these values, these attributes are saying, okay, place this second button relative, no, I'm sorry, yeah, second to this button here. So you can set objects relative to other objects. And that is pretty much everything that I wanted to show you. One more thing, if you want to hide and show elements, this enable button is a great option to disable buttons. So for instance, if you did not want anybody to click on it because maybe these fields here are not filled out, you can set the enabled on that button and just do set enabled as a method call and set that true or false. And the other one is the actual visibility of it, which is here. So you can set it to visible, invisible, or gone. If it's gone, it means it removes it and any relative. Let's see, let me change this, change it to gone. And you can see my second button, because it was relative to the first button, that first button's no longer there because it's gone. That button actually, the display gets reset on that one. Setting that new second button. If I keep that invisible, you can see that it's not on my screen. You can see the outline of it if I click off. It's not visible, but because that second button relies on that object, it's still there. That second button is still in this layout. And that's equivalent to the CSS display none and display visible, or I'm sorry. Yeah, display none. And what's the other one I'm thinking of? What's that?
Visibility hidden.
Yeah, visibility hidden, thank you. So display none, visibility hidden is the same thing as here, where display none actually takes it out of the DOM, essentially. It doesn't affect the other elements. Visibility affects all the preceding elements around it, but it's not there visibly. So yeah, you can play around with that one and see, but those are the differences for that one. And yeah, I could spend a whole week on all these different features. Minimum height, minimum width. For the most part, they're pretty self-explanatory. Play around with them, see what they do. If they don't do anything, you can always look up the documentation on these guys. Just show documentation. It'll bring up the documentation, and you can see what the background tint mode is, that sort of thing. So anyway, kept you long enough, and hopefully that helped you lay out beautiful designs in Android and color them and shape them and do whatever you need to do for your next project.